You proceed with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, look, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you today. I appreciate there's a big decision to be made by the council, and it's pleasing to be part of that process. Look, it's clear to see that we understand that the council has some matters it wants to work through, particularly around the environmental compliance framework coming out of the review. So I just want to acknowledge that. And it's obvious that council will need to have confidence that the RWSS can deliver on the desired environmental outcomes. HBRC, as your company, wants this too, and we see it as essential to the commencement of the scheme and the sustainability of the scheme, and we want to acknowledge there is some work to do there to satisfy you. As we start this presentation, I just want to say it's important from our perspective that we look for solutions, and the intent of the presentation today is to overview what we already have in place as far as consent conditions and compliance management is concerned for the scheme. We're not starting from a zero base. There's actually quite a comprehensive framework in place, acknowledging that there may be questions and other things to work on to meet the councillor's requirements. So I'm going to hand over to Stephen to give you an overview. There's the potential for us to spend about a week going through this presentation because it obviously covers quite an extensive subject matter. So if I can ask that Stephen can talk through at a high level the key principles of the slide, and then perhaps take the questions at the end, because there will undoubtedly be a number of questions to follow. And then following his presentation, I'd just like to give a small close to outline HBRC's view in terms of next steps, and then more than happy to answer any questions that there might be, and happy to stay here all day if that's what it needs. So I'll hand over to Stephen.
Yes, thank you, Blair, and Chair and councillors. I've got 10 slides to go through. The first 5 have got a reasonable amount of detail on them, but these are the ones I'm going to gloss over and just give you an oversight on. There's 5 key slides at the back, which are much more graphical and punchy, so probably focus on those. I'd like to make a couple of introductory comments, just listening to the discussion this morning. Firstly, about the potential declaration to the Environment Court. The first thing I should say is that I clearly got the consent holders hat on. I've been advising HBRC right through the board inquiry process, and I'm here to provide the consent holders' view. In doing that, any declaration to the Environment Court, as I understand it, would be an interpretation of how certain conditions in the granted consents that have been given to HBRC might be interpreted and applied. I've heard this morning that perhaps there was a view that the Environment Court might come along and change the conditions or have powers to do that. That's not the case. These conditions were first granted by the Board of Inquiry under Justice Chisholm in 2014. They were appealed to the High Court, and through that process, Justice Chisholm's board admitted they'd made a mistake in imposing DIN limits specifically on the resource consents held by HBRC, and it would have been a mistake to put those sort of limits, which are in-stream limits, which aren't in control of any particular consent holder, on any farmer or any consent. So they admitted that mistake, and then they went through a process of looking at that again through the High Court, and then the High Court was asked specifically from one of the parties whether the consents could be cancelled, and the High Court said no, they've been granted. And one of the key premises under the Resource Management Act is when you have a granted consent, you can rely on that and the conditions. So that's the first point. The second point is around this, what I call condition framing. In the RMA, and this is a clear legal framework, there's something called the Newbury principles around consent conditions granted on resource consents. Newbury's an old English case, comes from the Town and Country Planning Board in England, and it's been adopted and applied by the high courts in New Zealand. So essentially, conditions on resource consents for anyone have to meet certain key principles. They need to be enforceable, which is the regional council's responsibility. They have to be lawful. They have to be fair. They have to be workable, practical, workable. They need to be equitable. And also, they can't actually frustrate the undertaking of the activity that the consent was granted for. So that was a mistake the board made. They imposed an obligation to meet 0.8 DIN on the consent holder. Obviously couldn't be achieved in some catchments because, and that was illegal, and the board recognised that. And I thought they did a very good job of looking at that issue, which was quite challenging, and working up some new conditions, which they finally got over the line in 2015. If any of the parties wanted to challenge those conditions that were granted to HBRC, they had an opportunity to appeal the lawfulness of those conditions to the High Court in June 2015. None of the parties did, and the reason HBRC didn't was that after looking at them and doing some work, the company felt that it could certainly meet the new obligations around the DIN limit that was actually not in the consent, but there was a set of conditions that we need to keep our weather eye on that. So that's a really important point. Any Environment Court declaration can't go and change the conditions. It can look at how they might be interpreted by the consent holder. So that's perhaps if there's any questions on that, it would be worth taking them now.
Chair.
So, through you, Chairman, do you actually believe there is any merit in joining with these environmental lobby groups and going to the Environment Court?
I personally no, and we'll need to get to the end of my presentation to actually, I can explain why, because I think we're quite confident there are a number of actions that can be taken to meet the consent conditions. So that's my opinion, but I think I need to get through my presentation to come back and fully answer that.
I just add to that that the board of HBRC has yet to sit and discuss this matter, so HBRC's position on this matter is unresolved at this point in time.
Any question,
I
Councillor?
I have a question, but I can wait till because he will probably answer my question with his presentation.
Councillor Bailey.
I'm just curious to know, Stephen, you've offered us a legal opinion at the end of the day. Are you qualified to give that sort of opinion?
Look, Councillor, if you could sit on that question, please. Can we proceed?
Sure, certainly. So the first thing I wanted to do was really pick up from where I think Mr. Palmer got to in his review on these matters. In managing any activities, including the RWSS, under the Resource Management Plan, Plan Change 6, really have to keep the key objectives of Plan Change 6 in mind. And the Board of Inquiry did this when they granted RWSS its consents, and they were the first consents granted under Plan Change 6. They looked at all of these objectives in the round and they weighed up, and on balance they said, with the conditions they imposed, we think that the RWSS meets these objectives. So that's the starting point, not any focus on any particular limit or target. So that's really all I wanted to say about these objectives. TT1's the key one, and they're all, there's no priority here, they're all equal. They cover things like ecosystem maintenance, water quality, Māori, and the provision for primary production.
If you can just skip through those quite quickly, because we know a lot of this stuff already.
So listen, this again is quite a busy slide. I'm not going to go through this. I call it the condition architecture, and if you want, for want of a better word, I'm the architect of these quite complex conditions. They're about 2 inches thick. There's 13 schedules, and they all hang together and work together, but they're quite complex, and I think I'm bringing together the key points the council needs to do in this presentation. Perhaps this is another way of answering Councillor Bailey's point. I see myself as a conditions expert. I was engaged by with Principal Environment Court Judge Newby, and we did a conditions roadshow last year in 12 centres, 20 different sessions with practitioners about how you write conditions to meet those Newby principles. So that's all I wanted to say on this slide. Through developing the conditions and through requests by a number of key stakeholders, we do have an incredibly thorough community stakeholder input all along the way as the scheme works. They follow the scheme through looking at the key iwi issues through a kaitiaki runanga, and they've got some obligations and some powers. Construction liaison group happens because there's actually been quite a lot of effects while construction happens. The Ruataniwha Biodiversity Advisory Board's a key agency. They have lots of people lobbied to be on that, and that's a broad group. And after the scheme's in place through management, the scheme operations and liaison group will be heavily involved. So that's all I wanted to say on that. So I'm going back the wrong way. Whoops. Okay. The next slide is about our offset mitigation project. You've seen this before, I won't labour this. But again, as a key finding, I've just put paragraph 1208 of the Board of Inquiry decision. I'm not relitigating this, I'm just saying that they made a key finding that this package provides for positive environmental outcomes, and it should be viewed together with the management plans, and they made a finding that this package was fit for purpose for the effects that couldn't actually be avoided.
Can I come in here at this point, Mr. Daish, particularly on that table? Have you done any modelling at all that indicates what the mitigation effect is of that $10 million expenditure? In other words, how much nitrogen or other nutrient is mitigated as a consequence of this investment?
Yeah, this package is mainly focused at direct effects on things like forests and areas that might be. This is a focus on direct effects rather than the nitrogen issue. The project number E in the Papanui stream will have a major beneficial effect for that very degraded stream, both in terms of nitrogen and phosphorus. So that's one that's very targeted.
Hang on, let's be clear on this. You've just stated that there will be major effects on nitrogen and phosphorus. Is that what you're saying?
No, I said that the mitigation package is mainly focused around direct effects of construction where forests might be taken out and there's offsetting of new forests to be planted, riverbed management around the upper...
You mentioned the Papanui stream.
The Papanui stream, so that is one where there's a major planting program that will go on, and that stream is very degraded at the moment, and the ecologists that have advised HBRC have looked at that program of work and the expenditure and the focus and said that will have a very marked benefit for that particular catchment from an ecological point of view.
Does that equate to mitigating nutrient effects?
There will be some mitigation effects, but most of the mitigation will be through the farm environmental management plans on farm.
Let's just not jump there. Can you tell me, have you modelled and can you expect some equation that identifies that mitigation in terms of the nutrient loss mitigation?
Again, most of the nutrient loss mitigation is on farm.
So the answer is no.
I have not modelled that.
Thank you. Councillor Belford.
The label on this chart is mitigation and offset approach projects. Is it not fair to say that over 5 million of this 10 million is basically offset money that is being spent because we're flooding 400 hectares of land, right?
Yes, that's right, Councillor Belford.
So to present this as an environmental benefit is a bit disingenuous, isn't it?
No, that's why it's called mitigation and offset. Those two terms have they're legally looked at by the Environment Court. Mitigation is making something less worse. Offsetting is actually a direct compensation for a direct effect. So they are very different, and this package includes both elements.
Perhaps if I can just add, the intent of this slide is just to demonstrate this is one component of the package that's already in place for the scheme. It's not to highlight it as being the solution to all of the matters. The series of slides is here to say these are all of the mitigations, effects and compliance regimes that are already consented and put in place. More than happy to take questions on them, but there's no intent for this particular slide to present itself as the total solution to...
No, I wasn't suggesting that for a moment, Mr. O'Keefe. What I was wanting to know was, has that mitigation investment been modelled in terms of its mitigating effect? And the answer is no. Councillor Bailey.
Yeah, thank you. So would it be fair to say, Stephen, then that if the scheme were to not proceed, that $5 million of that 10 million wouldn't have to be spent at all, or?
That's right. That's the round numbers, I think. Yes. Okay. So just make sure I got the right. I want to specifically talk about Project D. This is the Priority Spring-Fed Stream project, and the objective of this particular project, and it relates to the further slides, is to protect and enhance water quality and stream habitat in a number of spring-fed streams in the Ruataniwha Plains, and those are listed there. These streams provide good habitat for eels and other native species, and some are important locations for spawning and juvenile rearing. So this project will feature in the next slides as quite a key project around dealing with overall aquatic ecological health in those areas. Now, this is a very busy slide, and it comes from a key report which was prepared for HBRC by Dr. Young and Dr. Clapcott from Cawthron Institute, and it really explains this concept at the bottom about macro invertebrate community index, or what's known as MCI. Their report I'd commend the councillors to read. It's really important around both the DIN limit and how the wider MCI process works. Essentially, on the top line is there are a number of activities that affect freshwater streams and rivers in New Zealand. Channel works, diffuse nutrient inputs, which is the one that we're talking about here with the DIN limit and other nutrient limits. Point source organic inputs, so something that might come out of a pipe from a sewage plant, for example. Removal of shade, stormwater inputs, sediment coming in, and also reduced flows in terms of how you deal with minimum flows. So there's a whole range of issues that affect water quality, and this just shows the direct effects which are in that middle group. If you look at diffuse nutrient inputs, it has a strong link to increased plant growth, which we've heard about from Mr. Palmer, which drives periphyton growth. Nothing to do with the health of animals or invertebrates living in the streams, and that comes down to habitat changes, and that's picked up in this key MCI indicator.
Barker.
Could you give to me a distinction between what you regard as a strong link and a direct link?
I think the strong link is a driving factor. So it's a higher order, the way I read Dr. Young's report. A direct link is that while it might be strong, there is still a pathway there.
So it's the answer to the question is that the difference between strong and direct is influence on the outcome.
Yes.
Okay.
Right. This pie chart's quite important because I've titled it Tuki Tuki Water Quality, Quantity and Quality Management, and it really has a focus mainly on Ruataniwha water storage scheme management, but Obviously, we also know that other farms will be managed under Plan Change 6. So there's various on-farm techniques which can be applied to management. Certainly, Plan Change 6 for all farms over 4 hectares, if they exceed a limit, will require resource consent and FEMP requirements. Both Ruataniwha farms and other farms will be required to exclude stock and fence. Ruataniwha itself has a very comprehensive FEMP process, which includes auditing and review in the consent conditions, and ultimately, if a certain provision of nutrients are provided to a scheme farmer and they do not meet those obligations, there's an ability to review and ultimately, through control of the scheme, turn the water off for that farm until they come back and get to the practice that they've signed up for. So much more prescriptive, more detailed for Ruataniwha, in my view. Also, what's called the approved outputs for each farm deals with end control. It also deals with the fact that Ruataniwha has to be P neutral on a sub-catchment basis across all of the farms it services in a sub-catchment. And that was a very important element through the Board of Inquiry. None of the parties disagreed with that, as far as I'm aware, and I think that's a very responsible element. It's Dr. McDowell, who's a key expert in the area, gave us lots of good mitigation options that could be applied on those farms to deal with the P management aspects. So that's the on-farm stuff. Periphyton, which is the slimes that grow in the river. The first point is that periphyton in the Hawke's Bay rivers and the Tukituki Braided River is an historical and ongoing issue during summer, and particularly in hot, dry summers where the rivers get low. The Ruataniwha flushing flows do provide a management tool that would otherwise not be available, and that flushing flow has nothing really to do with some element of dealing with an effect from the scheme, but it actually has a benefit way over and above any effect that the scheme might have for the ongoing quality of those rivers where the flows will go. And also, of course, periphyton high summer flows included in Plan Change 6, enhanced by the scheme with its higher residual flow than normal over mouth, also adds to the fact that the rivers won't get as low as they have been historically, and that's a key driver of Plan Change 6. In terms of aquatic ecosystem health, which is the third element, MCI monitoring I've talked about is a key tool, and there's some adaptive management opportunities which I'll take you through next. The scheme also has to meet these NZ guidelines, which were set by Dr. Hickey with specific reference to the Tukituki scheme, river and animals growing in that. These are the toxicity limits, and this is the one where in any sub-catchment, if we get towards 80% of that trigger, there's quite a process of adaptive management goes along with that. And obviously the DIN target, there's an adaptive management approach through the scheme's conditions as well. And so all of those are monitored and managed on a sub-catchment basis. Now this also is a very important slide. This deals with ecological health focused MCI monitoring and adaptive management conditions. Now, the first thing I'd like to talk about is the left-hand bullet point. HBRC actually proposed this MCI monitoring as part of the Board of Inquiry process. We offered it up as some additional protection between the draft decision and the final decision, and it's quite new and groundbreaking for any of these sorts of conditions in New Zealand. Unfortunately, even though this MCI monitoring approach is favoured significantly by the NGOs, people like Fish and Game and EDS, as the solution, as a very good solution, a good technique, they unfortunately didn't agree that it should be applied to Ruataniwha for reasons that astound me. But anyway, they didn't. So after the final decision, because we thought this would add quite a high level of extra protection and monitoring, HBRC proceeded to vary its own conditions through Section 127 and add this key MCI monitoring and adaptive management approach to its consent conditions as a voluntary matter. So the way it works is there's a new Schedule 13 in our consent conditions that we added in after the Board of Inquiry process. It's titled Ecological Health Monitoring Protocol. It requires MCI monitoring, which is quite a time-consuming and reasonably expensive practice, at 15 tributary sites within the RWSS consented area. That monitoring is to be done on a baseline basis, so 4 times per year for 2 years prior to the supply of water, and then for 15 years after the supply of water. The purpose is to identify long-term trends in MCI levels in each of these subcatchments, these small streams and rivers. And we've also suggested that there be a new review condition added, 30A, where HBRC, as the consent manager and regulator, can amend the conditions and the volume of that project D to provide additional mitigation or offsetting as required. So it's quite an important water quality protection technique which we've added into the consent conditions.
Mr. Dace, just a question from Councillor Wilson.
Thank you, Chair. You talk about 4 times per year, and baseline was the word you used. So you telling me when we get to a certain flow rate, or you're not going to do it each quarter? You're going to do it 4 times in the summer, perhaps?
No, so that's all set out in the protocol. The protocol was developed by, again, Dr. Young and Dr. Osei. The 4 times needs to be done at different times of the year, different flow rates to give a good baseline. And remember, a lot of these streams are quite degraded now, so they'll likely have low MCI limits. And we just want to get a good handle on each of them. We have a good data set, so when Ruataniwha starts, it knows what the starting point was, and if it's actually in any subcatchment it's operating in, we're starting to see a decline in MCI, we can move in and do actions to actually bring the aquatic health of that particular stream up and make sure it never goes down from the baseline.
Thank you. Councillor Belford.
So you would probably be aware that we got a report saying that this was one measure where there was no headroom to work with, that virtually all, I think all monitored sites are currently exceeding the target, if I recall correctly. But doesn't this present while everybody agrees that this is a important measure of ecological health, doesn't it present the same, when you say take action, what can you say to an individual property owner to do via a condition or something that will have a measurable effect on MCI rates? So doesn't it raise the same sort of issues as you've argued? On the other hand, you can't tell a farmer to do something because the DIN limit in the catchment is too high. What's that farmer supposed to do about that? If the MCI limit is too high, what's the farmer supposed to do about that?
Can I perhaps just start with a response? The reason that the review highlighted that there was no headroom for degradation of MCI is that the policy objective in the plan is to improve ecological health, and we are required to maintain or improve. So therefore, there cannot be a decline in the MCI rates. We do know that the strongest drivers of MCI generally are shading, water temperature, and sediment. So we do know that through good riparian management, stock exclusion, shading, that we'll get good outcomes in terms of MCI. In terms of the current subcatchments in the Ruataniwha Plains, what's interesting is that we have some subcatchments that have relatively better MCI than others, but higher DIN levels. So already we see from the data when we compare DIN and MCI, a lack of correlation, and that again reaffirms the point that there are other management measures which are probably more important in terms of MCI. Do you want to add anything, Steve?
I think that's exactly the answer. And I was just going to go back to that previous slide from which would go back to. So this is the one. There's all sorts of things that you could do on a subcatchment basis to perhaps take action to improve MCI. I see this as a scheme. This is a scheme responsibility, not an individual farmer. It might have a number of farmers in the subcatchment it would work with. Things like simple shading and riparian planting, which is the key benefit. One of the key benefits from that Papanui stream mitigation project, for example, could be applied quite easily. And my advice from the water ecologists is that if MCI was dropping, there's some very practical, ready things that the scheme could do to work on to arrest that.
Can I just follow up before, Councillor, and one over here? I just want to pursue this some more. You're saying that there are these mitigation opportunities, and members of the scheme are the target for discussion around that. Will the scheme invest in, as a whole, those mitigation measures? Is that correct? Is that
Yes, that's right.
So is that a demand on the farmers or on the scheme?
It's a demand on the scheme, but of course the farmers are paying for the scheme, so indirectly on the farmers as well.
So just give me some latitude here. Is it beyond the $10 million investment that you've identified in that earlier stage?
Yes. So potentially, and the scheme's already signing up for some investment along these streams. If we're seeing some MCI changes that needs more investment,
yes.
The principle would be the scheme would either voluntarily add additional mitigation to keep MCI up at a level that doesn't decrease, or if that didn't happen, HBRC has the power through the review condition to require more money to be put in at that time.
By the scheme?
By the scheme.
Directly? But would we be paying as the major shareholder in the scheme? Well,
someone needs to pay, but that's some extra direct money would need to be applied, and if the council reviewed the consent conditions to do that, they'd do that knowing that they're a partial scheme holder, I think.
My understanding, if the party who causes the impact is the one who bears the cost, the council is not obliged to have to fund these. That's obviously a consideration for the council, and it would depend on the individual circumstances. So if it's a particular farm with particular shading issues, then the scheme would work with that farm to say, we need to address this, and it's your property that's a contributor, which is affecting the scheme's ability to meet its obligations. Therefore, there would be an arrangement
I hear what you're saying, but I did get two answers there. One is that the scheme will pay, and one that the farmers will pay.
I think the answer is both, based on the circumstances. So if it's a direct farm-created situation, then we're now speaking in terms of how a company of the future might have individual commercial discussions. But in principle, the scheme would have a discussion to say you need to do X, and then there would be a commercial negotiation to resolve who pays. But at the end of the day, the scheme can switch off the water if it's not satisfied that the farm's meeting its requirements.
And do those farmers know they're going to have to pay?
Do they know they're going to have to pay? Well, we haven't identified all of the specific issues yet, but every farm knows that it has to spend money to ensure that its farm environmental management plan meets the requirements. So at a philosophical level, the answer is yes.
Councillor.
What's up? I mean, but what you're saying is, yeah, I need, as in the farm plan that I agree with the scheme on, I need to implement, and I need to pay whatever money I need to as a farmer to implement it. But you're saying on top of that, there are catchment-wide or sub-catchment-wide mitigation measures that might be required to meet this goal, and you're saying you have the authority under your commercial relationship with these farmers to instruct them that, hey guys, you're all going to have to chip in here and support this portfolio of mitigation measures so that we can meet our environmental. Is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is,
and our chairman is asking, do these guys really have a clue that this is coming their way?
I think we're in the space of speculating possible outcomes with possible responses.
We are, because that's the risk you're asking us to take, is that you have a scheme in your back pocket here that is going to adequately protect the environment. And so you're saying, oh yeah, we can come up with stuff yet to be invented that will do the job, but we actually haven't talked to any farmers about it. We haven't talked about the costs of it, but just trust us, we'll deliver it as part of our commercial relationship.
I'm not saying that the response is trust us, it'll be right, she'll be right. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is there'll be a specific set of circumstances to be identified that require specific solutions that can only be addressed once those needs are identified. You also need to remember that the scheme will inherit all of the indices that exist on day one, whether it had anything to do with them or not. So there's two sides to the equation in terms of taking accountability for what happens next.
Appreciate the answers.
I have a
Councillor
question on that. I wasn't going to ask any questions, but this is not really appropriate to you, but from where I'm sitting, why wouldn't we ask those farmers to fix the mess they made in the first place without us investing all this money? I mean, Papanui Stream, for example, why aren't the farmers planting up riparian plantings and fixing the Papanui Stream right now?
I guess that's really a matter between the council and the farmers as at today.
The question was inappropriate.
So
I was just boiling over here, that's all.
Chair, if I may, can I just very quickly note that stock exclusion regulations are coming through at the national level. They are also embedded in Plan Change 6, so stock exclusion is a requirement. Farm environment plans will identify opportunities for riparian planting where that delivers an environmental benefit. So already we have in train a range of policy measures that will be driving towards better riparian management. And I guess the point being made here by HBRC is that the monitoring program that they have offered up and that is now in the consent condition will give us information over time as to whether our existing baseline policy is delivering the outcomes, and if not, therefore there's a trigger mechanism for increasing the level of activity.
Thanks, James. Can I just, before you do move on, can you make a note that I'm particularly interested to know the quantum, the investment that's required of HBRC globally in terms of wider catchment, that will be a capital cost to the scheme, if indeed it is over and above what is required by individual farmers.
Certainly note the question, whether a speculative answer can be given. I'm not 100% sure.
I think we're getting to the nub of this now, is that we're needing more science, more answers around this stuff. You need to say to us, we've modelled it, we've had this basket of conditions and monitoring, etc. You can monitor all you like, but if you don't stop the stuff getting in, that's where the rubber hits the road. So I'm wanting to see models of land use and mitigation to see whether it works. And you haven't done that, so we need to know that. So
that's a fair question.
That's speculation.
No, I retract my comment. That's a fair question.
Oh, Stephen, flashy flows, new word for me. Can you just tell me what they are?
What I'm saying is the sort of very quick up and down flows that affect the sort of the habitat and where animals are living in a stream. So, for example, some hydro schemes go up and down playing the market, and they have, they go from zero to, or near to zero, to very high flows in a very short amount of time. So that's that flashy flows concept. Flushing flows would just be, we'd piggyback quite a steady amount of water through onto a fresh to last quite a number of days, whereas the flashy flows is up and down very quickly. We're not looking to do that with this scheme. Mr. Chair, could I just add two comments to your question about the modelling and this issue? Firstly, in keeping phosphorus neutral, which the farm, each FMP will need to do, a lot of those key mitigations I will do will be around things that will benefit MCI, stopping overland flows, sedimentation, planting stream banks, those sorts of things. The very interesting fact that MFE has looked at in some of their reports, Taranaki, which has a very, very high dairy element and high stocking limit, they've got a very sort of long-standing riparian planting program, the MCI of their streams are excellent. And there's no reason why with good farm management we could get the same situation here. So my first question is that through the obligations under the FMPs, the farmers on farm will be doing some actions which will certainly benefit on their farms and how they interact with these streams in terms of MCI.
Please continue.
Okay, keep it rolling. Right. This is my second last slide, and again, quite an important slide. These are, I think someone mentioned earlier on that when we looked at the material contribution conditions that were inserted by the Board of Inquiry in its last decision and what that meant for Ruataniwha, we quickly identified there was a range of measures that could be applied to, if there was, based on monitoring, any material contribution identified for the scheme. Lots of actions that could be taken, which is what our conditions require us to do to deal with that. The first thing to note is that this plan shows the original zones for Ruataniwha in the darker, in the lighter colour, and then the extensions to those zone areas that were granted under a resource consent change in 2015. The top left-hand box, and we were asked questions about that through the process. The wider zones actually does benefit in management because the water's spread out wider in any subcatchment, and if you actually irrigate in those higher levels, there will be less direct pathways of N directly into the stream. So overall in the round, the land management advisors to HBRC and the scientists have said that that is overall beneficial for the DIN obligation. That could be applied. The second element, which is on the right-hand top of the box, DIN actually is highest in winter time when the scheme's not operating, and there is potential through capturing high flows in the winter when the water is actually available and using the scheme infrastructure to dilute those streams to bring any DIN exceedance down through a simple system of using the infrastructure. So what I've shown on this diagram is the main canal, which could be used for that purpose, but there's an extensive secondary network that also could be applied that goes right across these key Ruataniwha streams. So that's a very useful tool that the scheme has to deal with meeting its material contribution DIN obligations. We also have very detailed on-farm monitoring program with 5 focused farms, which will look at not only modelling farm outputs, but actually measuring those through different farm systems. They're on different catchments, different soil types, different farm types. That's in our consent conditions. We've already prepared 3 quite detailed farm environmental management plans for different soil types and different farming types. Those were, and looking at P reductions and N reductions, actually quite detailed. Those were delivered in Ms Mulcock's evidence to the Board of Inquiry, so we've already done quite a lot of work on some of these farms already. And the last item is that there are many on-farm mitigations that can be applied if needed progressively. Our key nutrient modelling report, which was delivered to the Board of Inquiry, it's report M2, had a number of appendices where before we lodged the applications, we tested really hard with the farm management experts, people like Alec Mackay from Ag Research, what might be the series of steps you could do around N and P reduction to realistically make a difference to N contribution from farms. There's a number of specific reports as appendices to that key report that went to the board in 2013 that deal with that issue. There's a series of about 5 separate specific reports dealing with this issue. Quite an important one done in 2012 by Dr. Mackay was if arable farms or dairy farms had to come down to quite low N levels over and above what they're currently achieving, could that be done profitably using different farm systems? And Dr. Mackay's report actually lays that out and how they would actually do that with the various mitigations, and the conclusion was that those farms could still remain profitable even if they had to bring in down quite extensively. So that's the fourth element around how the scheme can actually deal with any material contribution that's shown from its operations.
Thank you for that. We've had some questions on the way through. Are there any?
If I may, Chair, just maybe a couple of closing comments and then more.
There's one more slide, which is just very
sorry.
very quickly. Look, this is my final slide. Again, my opinion is that the RWS conditions framework is robust and it does have good checks and balances. The conditions framework was developed over 3 years with input from all parties. This evolved with lots of input. In my view, it is the best practice approach in New Zealand and is world leading. There are 3 layers of ongoing water quality monitoring and adaptive management required, one around MCI, one around the in-river nitrate nitrogen and the 80% trigger level, that's the one that deals with aquatic health, and the third one is about DIN material contribution. IMO projects are extensive and targeted, and the flushing flows do provide quite a unique management opportunity for purified and control in summer.
Thank you very much. That's very. You want a few closing remarks?
If I may, that would be great. Thank you. So look, there's a lot of information in there. The intent today was not to relitigate the previous discussions. It was really to demonstrate that there are some substantial building blocks when it comes to the environmental management plan for the scheme. It's HBRC's view that we can harness that existing framework, and with positive intent from the council, from HBRC and other key stakeholders, including the farmers, that we can develop an environmental package that meets the requirements, and there's a strong need for collaboration and leadership from all parties to achieve this. What we would like to advocate for relative to your deliberations today and next week is that the council considers a balanced decision which delivers the best possible outcomes for environment and economy, not or, and economy and jobs. We strongly believe that we can present a scheme that offers HBRC with the controls that it needs to meet its requirements, and to do so in a way that presents leadership to the region. And in fact, HBRC is committed to that process, which is why we're very satisfied to insert an environmental management plan condition precedent as part of the program. So our key ask of council as it considers its decision is that you recognise the merits of the scheme whilst working on building any additional confidence that you need around what the environmental management package will deliver. We are asking that you accept our recommendations in the letter, and I'm happy to go through those and take questions on those. The particular one that Mr. Palmer's noted, which we're happy to change, is that 3.3.4, where we highlighted conducting further review on incentives and disincentives around environmental outcomes. Very happy to modify that to the words that have been outlined in Mr. Palmer's recommendation, which essentially is HBRC works with council and others to go away and come back with a review of the environmental management package to see if it meets council's satisfaction, and that's left intentionally open to say council has to be satisfied with this. So I just want to clarify that. As the review that Mr. Palmer led and all the other parties have been involved in outlined, doing nothing is not an option. So HBRC would encourage council as its shareholder to make a decision. We know it's not necessarily the easiest decision to make, and this is a complex issue. So I just want to thank you for your time to allow us to walk you through what we believe is already there, and to note that HBRC is prepared to work with council and others to meet your requirements. Thank you.
I would note that council always makes balanced decisions. Councillor Belford.
2 questions on those comments. One is the This letter and what you've just said, does that reflect the position of the current board of HBRC?
Yes, it does reflect the position of the current board, and if the question relates to the new director appointments, those directors are not officially appointed to HBRC yet because the constitution of the company hasn't been changed, because the council minute hasn't been affirmed relating to their appointment. So there's a process issue there. But the other directors that have joined HBRC and are sitting in on HBRC affairs are aware of the letter and aware of the discussion.
So you would anticipate there would be further discussion with those new directors about this?
Well, I've got a telecon with them on the back of the meeting today to discuss this, and as is being proposed, essentially there's room for discussion with all interested parties in what we've proposed by inserting the conditions precedent required.
And my second question has to do with, Stephen, your presentation had a lot of use of the pronoun we, but it sounds like basically you and a number of consultants have come up with a scheme that you feel certainly on paper looks good. Meanwhile, our staff is unable to get more than 100 FEMPs out of the hands of actual farmers. So who actually do you see implementing the program that you've just outlined?
So look, perhaps the first thing I'll say is that this condition framework was tested right through the HBRC board and the senior managers every step of the way. So, for example, the decision to add the MCI process went through board discussions, and they were totally aware of that. Your main question was, we've also, before the moratorium came in, we were doing a lot of work around getting ready for the FEMP process. As part of the board process, we did a lot of detailed farm planning using example properties, and actually went through the exact process we need to follow. We've got a template, we've got 3 different types of farms and 3 different soil types all ready to go, and it would be the scheme owners' responsibility to make sure that all FMPs were done, the nutrient targets were set, and all this work was done, as any other consent holder would need to do. I've got no experience with how the non-scheme farmers are behaving, but my expectation is that if they sign up for this water, they know their obligations, and we'll be working very hard with them, and they'll deliver on their responsibilities. That's my expectation.
Chair, just an update on non-RWSS farmers. We have seen a significant surge in activity, particularly as a consequence of the council undertaking lots of publicity around the requirements for farm plans. We've taken out some billboards in Central Hawke's Bay and some media and things like that. And I think we're over 200 FEMPs through the door now, and all the providers are flat out. I think Ravensdown's just accredited, brought on 5 staff to do FEMPs in the Tukituki catchment. So we're seeing a big lift in activity.
Mr. Palmer, Councillor Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. Stephen, you've just heard James talk about the, he's come back to us a number of times about the FEMPs and about the ability of staff to actually, or the consultants to actually process all the FEMPs in time. Are you confident that the scheme will have the resources or the human resources to be able to manage the requirement for FEMPs? Because we're struggling to find staff, people to do it. So I'm just wondering.
Look, it's probably not fair on Mr. Daish to talk about resourcing requirements for HBRC and the scheme. That's not his purview. I think we need to be upfront and acknowledge there's a challenge to meet the timetable that's set for 2018. We've already engaged with Council on ensuring there's clarity around the expectations for the scheme operators, and we'll be meeting with the farmers in the next couple of weeks to outline to them what they need to do and by when. And there's certainly an awareness that in terms of the service providers to meet these timetables, there is a challenge, and there's no denying that.
Councillor Wilson.
Just going to the recommendations, Chair, 2.2 requests the board of HBRC Limited considers extending the moratorium to 1 month after dock land transfer. I have a real concern, or not a concern, just a question around what else are you going to spend the money on? I mean, what else is there to spend money on other than, as it says further down, you've got to roll over your agreements, and there is a growing appetite for more work to be done on the environment management package, how that comes together. We've exercised that this morning. So actually, what else is there you could spend money on? And in fact, is the moratorium, has it run its course?
Look, I think the short answer is there's going to be ongoing requirements to spend money to work with council to ensure that between the two parties, both organisations' needs are met. Whatever decisions are taken, there's just a series of ongoing questions. Every question needs an answer, and every answer takes time and requires resources. So in short order, spending nothing is probably not an option, because that's effectively saying the company can't breathe. But in principle, the company's happy to continue the existing arrangements that are in place with the council, where the directors have the capacity to ensure that they're meeting their legal obligations, that the company is ensuring that it meets its financial obligations with regard to existing commitments, and that there's the capacity for the water contracts to be maintained, and if we do more work around the environment, that it's acknowledged that there's likely to be some costs to be incurred to deliver on that. So HBRC is comfortable with the proposal.
Thank you, gentlemen. Sorry, Debbie, you've got a question.
Thank you. Blair, with the recommendations that we have in our paper, there's an absence of sending a clear signal to the community around the scheme. So I'm wondering from you, how difficult is it going to be should this go forward without a clear signal sent as to council's intent for the scheme? How difficult would it be for you to maintain the value that you currently have on your balance sheet associated with the contracts that have been signed and the ability to roll them over?
I think it's fair to say we'd have to pause and evaluate the impact on the finances, if any, in discussion with our auditor, and we'd also have to discuss with the farming community the impact of any essentially decision not to decide on its view of rolling over the water contracts and its further participation. So I can't give you a categorical answer other than to say we'd need to evaluate the impact. The short answer is it obviously makes it harder, because when people have clarity, it makes it easier for decisions to be made.
Thank you very much. I'll come back to that if you've got a question for James.
Oh, as a follow-up, or just to continue.
Well, could you just hold it for a moment? Because I think we're up to the point where we want to take further advice from Mr. Palmer, subject to your delivery. So thank you for that. Unless anyone's got a burning question for the two gentlemen. You have Paul, very brief.
Quick one. Recommendation 2.3, talk about the expenditure on rolling over the foundation water use agreements. Have you got a rough idea or any idea of the dollar cost that would be involved there?
We have modelled that, and I haven't got the absolute detail because it's going to be on a time invested in the market, so it won't cost a lot if the farmers all sign the agreements without a lot of contact, but if we have to go out and individually talk to each of the farmers, it'll cost more. So, but it's not going to be an enormous amount of money, but there will be some money to be spent.
Just a ballpark figure what enormous means?
Tens of thousands.
Tens of.
Thank you. Unless the questions are here, we'll dismiss these fine gentlemen.
Mr. Chairman, would it not be best to have them available as we...
Well, they can be available in the room, Councillor, but what we now need to do is go to the next step, which I'll foreshadow once they've departed the scene.
Okay, so my next question was going to be, given what we've heard, James, what else would you change in the recommendations?
Okay. Can I intervene there? Because I just want to do that and then go to asking that question of James. So thank you. If you're able to remain, don't leave the building.
Mr. Chair, can I make one final comment? I've prepared, there's overhead here. I've also prepared a one-page about all the parties' positions on MCI, which is just,
Yes.
so I
Thank
think that's
you.
quite useful. So,
the-
I'll leave those
the
there.
overheads are here available to councillors. Thank you. Councillors, I want to draw a line there, and I'm sorry to interrupt the flow of your question, Debbie, but so we certainly will quickly come back to it. What I'm wanting to suggest now is that we move, we're at 11:45. I'm expecting probably half an hour or so of debate, and I'm just wanting your indulgence to follow a process around that. And I'm currently looking at the recommendations, and once, if you're subject to your agreement, we can then pursue issues with James about the recommendations. And I'm suggesting these amendments to the, or if you like, I'm foreshadowing potential change to the recommendations. I'm suggesting that in fact we change the order of 2.2 and 2.3. That is, 2.2 becomes 2.3 and 2.3 becomes 2.2. Would that be it's the logic of it, I think, needs to be clear to us, and I'm suggesting that the new 2.2 has, as it's on the very last line, review the existing. If we're looking current 2.3, the last line, review the existing RWSS environmental management package. I'm suggesting we delete RWSS and insert Ruataniwha catchment. I'm then seeking to add to that. Well, the point of that is that the feedback I've had is that the entire catchment needs consideration as opposed to just scheme users, the Ruataniwha scheme users. And I think we've had evidence of that today, that we need to incorporate catchment-based issues and in this potential report back to council. So I'm foreshadowing that. If you don't want it, that's fine.
Just a question, Chair. By ask, I mean the recommendation actually talks about expenditure by HBRC. HBRC is not responsible for the whole catchment; they're only responsible for the RWSS. So I'm just a little if you could clarify that for me.
Well, I'd be surprised if you can detach the plans that are in motion. The scheme itself needs to have compliance with certain environmental outcomes. In my view, it's impossible to detach scheme users from non-scheme users in making an environmental assessment, and we've already had foreshadowed the catchment-based interventions that are needed.
So just a point of clarification then, Chair, are you, what you're suggesting to me then is that HBRC should be incurring expenditure to deal with the whole of the catchment issue and not just what they're responsible for?
I think that's inevitable.
Further question. I'm not unhappy with that, because when we're funding HBRC, you're talking about the council anyway, so they're one and the same in terms of the money to go out.
Yep.
My question to you is a technical one, Chair, and that is that it refers, the current 2.3 refers to an existing RWSS environmental management package, and you're suggesting just take out RWSS and insert Ruataniwha catchment, but is there an existing Ruataniwha environmental management package?
And I wonder whether, in fact, my suggestion, and that's all it is that we remove the word existing as well. Review the environmental management package.
Or develop an Ruataniwha catchment environmental package. I think that's what you're suggesting, because we don't have a Ruataniwha catchment package yet, do we?
Chair, so look, we don't have a Ruataniwha catchment package. We have Plan Change 6, which includes a range of provisions that then flow through into the RWSS consents. In paragraph 12 of the paper, I tried to make clear that the existing environmental management package is a catch-all for the sum total of the environmental management elements of the scheme. So the idea was to acknowledge that there's already a base. We're going to review that, and then come back with some advice about how to modify it as opposed to starting from scratch. So I just wanted to be very, very clear that Council wasn't asking us to go back to the drawing board and start from scratch, and that you do want us to look at those existing provisions that are there with the scheme. And Chair, if I could also just say, it would be helpful if you are looking at the wider package, which was the point of 2.6, in relation to 2.3, it would probably be more sensible to talk about the Tuki catchment, not the Ruataniwha catchment.
Yep, right, that's okay. Can I go back a step and ask this question? To me, the logic says we swap the order. In other words, we go 2.2 and 2.3 because the 2.3 asks us to modify the existing agreement, and then 2.2 asks us to extend the current agreement. To extend the agreement. So two different propositions. Are you comfortable to swap the order without reference to the content?
Chair, I'm not comfortable because 2.2 is it's just an issue to extend the moratorium. 2.3 is an expenditure issue. It's entirely different.
I don't think it makes a difference.
Okay, that's fine.
It's okay. On technical matter, Chair, I thought you declared the time for questions was over and now on to debate. You're asking us questions. I'll just leave that.
I think we need to satisfy ourselves on the recommendations before we go into debate. Councillor Hewitt.
I'd like to go back to my question to our independent advisor. James, given what we've heard this morning, what would you recommend is changed in here?
I had perhaps assumed in drafting the paper, and again, apologies, it was drafted in haste, that implicit in 2.4 and 2.5 is the continued intention by the Council to invest subject to conditions precedent being met. Now, Mr O'Keefe in his letter to the Council in 3.3.1 did recommend that the Council maintains its commitment to invest in 80 million. And I guess just apropos the conversation we had with Mr O'Keefe in the closing stages of that last session, there's a question therefore whether the Council is unclear that in modifying CP in 2.4 and 2.5 that it is signalling its intention to continue to proceed with the RWS subject to conditions, or is there some other articulation of the Council's position that would need to be worked through? And on that, I'd just say we then start getting dangerously close to modifying the position in the LTP and triggering the special consultative procedure if the Council's substantive position around the scheme is changing. So I'm taking it as read that this is a modification of the CPs. We're continuing to progress the RWS subject to these pieces of work being undertaken.
Councillor Belford.
I realize that you would like to focus us on what you see as two new or modifying of two conditions precedent, but as I raised earlier in connection with the HBRC letter, no conditions precedent are presently met, correct? So that's the reality of the situation, and whether we put that in terms of basically, we might want to note that today, first of all, and effectively say we're comfortable with some of these just apparently just happening off in the back room somewhere. We're going to renegotiate terms with our investors. We're going to renegotiate a bankable construction contract and yada, yada, yada. But given what is stated in this letter, I would like to see us recognize the fact as they are, that we do not have any conditions
Point of order,
precedent met.
Chair. There's two conditions precedent absolutely met,
I hear you.
as they were written in 2014.
I hear what you're saying, Councillor, but
But I can't agree with that. That is actually incorrect.
it's the opportunity will be there for Councillor Belford to make a note, if he so wished, move the resolution to note, and we'll be able to consider it and debate that at the time. So I'm not upholding your point of order. Councillor Bevan.
Thank you, Chair. This is a difficulty because there are, HBRC is signalling to us that they're happy for some of the conditions precedent that we've previously acknowledged have been met, need to be reset, and we've discussed what they are, and then there's the one about the land swap, which HBRC's also proposing become a new condition precedent, which is not included in your recommendations, I note, James. I'm happy to deal with the recommendations here, debate those and finalise them, and then suggest that you come back to the HBRC meeting in a week's time with a reset of those other conditions precedent, which we can then debate and sign off on at that point in time.
So that's an action point for Mr Palmer. Are you happy that he takes that course of action? It does mean, however, that those issues won't be debated twice.
Don't understand that. Sorry.
I think Councillor Bevan is seeking to have tabled at the next meeting accompanying this recommendation from the committee that we include, if you like, a summation of the condition precedents in play currently or have been met. Is that it, Councillor? I think that's a sensible move.
Or alternatively, what I understood from that was we've got, picking up some of the threads of Tom and from Peter, is that we've got some which are, to be updated. There's been changes in them, and what we were looking for, I would thought at the next meeting, was an updated list of conditions precedent. So where the changes have been made, so we've got a clear, clean sheet of where we stand as of that point, rather than what they used to be, what we've got now, and what we think we might change them to. So I was just wanting it, as I see it, was a clean sheet. This is what they are, and this is what they've been changed.
Thank you, Councillor Barker. Any concern about that from anyone? I think it's quite reasonable request. Councillor Hewitt.
Thank you. I think that's a good idea because you're incorporating the wisdom, but I would also articulate that based on the long-term plan assumption that the council maintains its commitment to invest the 80 million subject to the CPs. I think that needs to be articulated, not assumed in the overarching.
Are you comfortable for that consideration to be included as a recommendation? Well, perhaps you could. Sorry, Councillor.
Chair, if I may, look, I propose that I just bring back that matter into the paper for next week.
Councillor Barker.
Well, the only thing I have concern about is one about process with this. If the council has made a decision to do something, do we need to, from time to time, go along and reconfirm it over and over again just because we're apprehensive and nervous about it? Or do we, having made a decision, make the decision, move on until such time as the council decides to undo it? Well, I'm a fan of the latter. When we've made a decision, we've made a decision. And it stands.
Sure.
Until we undo it. So I'm not very fussed on
your
that.
point's accepted, Councillor.
I agree with that.
Well, the point's accepted, Councillor, and if anyone would like to move a further recommendation, they are quite free to do so. But we'll consider that in time. Can we move on from here? And can we move on from here? I'd made some suggestions, but I don't think they've particularly well. What we could do is simply move through the recommendations and consider them and add any that you wish. However, noting that we've already given an action point to James on the issues just discussed. Are you happy to proceed with the recommendations as stated, with people perhaps foreshadowing any adjustment before we move them? That'll clarify that. Councillor.
Just as a point of process here, it would be helpful if people. It would be very helpful. You've foreshadowed what you're thinking about doing, and if there are others who've got some resolutions or amendments they'd like to make, I think it would be really helpful if they all came out at the beginning on the deck, so we could see it in their totality, because each one interrelates to the other. And I just think it would be helpful if you went round the table and asked anybody who has any thoughts they'd like to change. Let's hear them up front, and then we can see the package at that point. Instead of having it drip. Any recommendations, changes.
Or changes to, okay, all right. Well, is that what you'd like to do, is to gather up changes?
If someone's got an amendment they can do, there's a process to follow.
I think we've got a process. I tried to influence it, but I didn't. So let's. Thank you, councillor. I'll start then with Mr. Palmer. Mr. Palmer, in the light of the discussions this morning, are there any elements of your recommendations that you would now suggest modifying in any shape to kick this process off?
Thank you, Chair. The question of the bankable construction contract, I just would note that at the point in time that CP was agreed as being met, there was a bankable construction contract, and I guess what we've seen from HBRC is a view that things have shifted and there's more work to do on securing a new bankable construction contract, if you like. I don't believe that needs to be picked up. The CP exists and stands, and it's just a question of satisfying that. And I guess the question is whether or not, given that HBRC's advice is that there's more work to do on that, whether or not you would want to publicly note through a recommendation and a resolution next week that it's now no longer met and that you would like it to be reset in time. I think that's consistent with the advice from Mr. O'Keefe on that. And could I just check with him that that's effectively what he's saying?
The way we've presented this saw as a reconfirmation process. I appreciate that we reset was used, but as it stands, the conditions met, but we're acknowledging that we need to go back and reprice it. So we need to give the council confidence that it remains met as the principle. So rather than saying it's not met, we need to reconfirm that it's not.
Yeah, right. So look, Chair, can I suggest that we include in the recommendations from today's meeting a catch-all resolution around the existing CPs. So bring back advice to you on existing CPs. Can
you pen that and we'll tag that on the end.
Tag that onto it.
Yeah, so if you could pen it.
Sorry, Chair. The only other thing that I did want to suggest for change is in 2.8. It refers to seeking legal advice on the likelihood of the Environment Court granting leave for such an application to be heard. But based on the balance of legal opinion that I have cited, I would be recommending removing that. But that's clearly a matter for councillors to determine whether or not you think the balance.
You would remove the clause and seek legal advice on the likelihood, blah, 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 be heard.
Correct.
Yeah, so finish that recommendation at the word conditions.
Correct.
Yeah, so can I just be clear? Can we be very clear on that? Whether, Leanne, have you got those?
So 2.8, just dropping from after the comma, after conditions, where it begins and, through to be heard, drop that, and I would still leave in and report to the Regional Planning Committee on 7th of June. EDS and Fish and Game are due to meet with me next week on the 31st, and so I don't think we've got time between now and next week to provide you with advice on that, so my preference would be to take it to the RPC. And in addition, I think some of these matters do relate to plan interpretation, and I think it's appropriate that the Regional Planning Committee be engaged on that.
Thanks, James. So have we got agreement?
Question on that. Can you just clarify how that reconciles with the advice we've just heard from Mr. Dash?
In what respect, Councillor?
Don't do it. He says don't do it. No need to do it.
Well, that can be debated.
Can I just perhaps provide a bit of advice on that, Chair, because I think it is an important question. It has been the view of the regulatory arm of the Council since the 2015 decision was delivered from the Board of Inquiry that essentially the consents are workable. And I say that on the basis that it's an adaptive management type regime. There are the Newbury principles which Mr. Dash referred to. So the Council's been of the view that we're unable to frustrate the consent, we're unable to impose unworkable and unreasonable provisions. Therefore, in practice, the consent can be adaptively managed over time. And so the regulatory framework, with all of its imperfections and ambiguities, has been deemed to be workable. However, I appreciate that our advice on that has continued to be contested, and that lies at the heart of the argument from Fish and Game and EDS that we now need an Environment Court declaration. So I guess I'm in a position of saying the council's staff advice to you as councillors on this matter remains contested in the community, and therefore it may simply be a better route to take is to seek an Environment Court declaration and put those matters to rest if the council's own staff interpretation is not universally supported or appreciated.
So, James, what you're saying to us is that, contrary to the prior advice from HBRC, your advice is to proceed with that.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I'd accept that if the wording was changed to say request that council staff and HBRC engage with the EDS. HBRC's got to be in there, surely.
Look, I have no problem. I have no problem with that.
Only they
Councillor,
can
with that.
represent the other stakeholders.
Any
like farmers and
difficulties
so
with that adjustment as
Well,
Councillor Barker?
But the only thing I want to say is that there's two things here. Let's pick up on the technical points. Workable consents. Yes, they can be workable consents. But the issue here for this council is, will they be effective? And what it springs to mind is the old saying, the operation was a success, but the patient died. So you can have the operational things, but at the end you've got to have the strategic outcome. And that's the issue here. It's not whether it's workable or not, but will it be effective? The second thing is that if people are going to go to court on issues which are of importance to us, and I suggest this is, it would be dumb of us not to be present and have our say. It would be just shooting ourselves in the foot. We should be, can I just finish? Now, as for the issue that Councillor Dick raised, we go there as the regional council in a representative function, not in our own rep. We have to take a representative function and all listen to it. And the last point is, if others wish to join, that's their choice. And I'm not a fan of directing HBRC to go and do this if that's what they don't want to do. It's their choice. We tell them we're going, others are going. If they want to turn up, that's their choice. If they don't, that's their choice. Leave it to them.
Well, we're moving into debate, but it does clarify that point. So have we got consensus to include HBRC or not? No. You don't? Okay, that's fine. Councillor Wilson. Blair, would you like to say something?
HBRC hasn't provided advice to council. The comment earlier was that we provided advice. Mr. Dash gave an opinion.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
The second part is my suggestion to support you to make a decision on this is that you use the words invite HBRC to participate, and then essentially HBRC can do as Mr. Barker says, decide whether that's appropriate.
Is that satisfactory to you, Mr. Barker? Councillor Barker? Okay, that's fine. Satisfactory to you, Councillor Dick?
Chair,
So-
I'll just finish it off.
Everyone's comfortable with that, unless Councillor Wilson can further any change to that.
No, I haven't. Just a process matter. I've just caught up with the Hawke's Bay tourism team out there. George has got a flight, wondering whether we're going to fit them in before lunch. I would also suggest that this will probably take more than half an hour to resolve. Yeah.
I wonder whether we just take a few more minutes just to resolve this. We'll then take a break in terms of this process and deliberate after tourism, Hawke's Bay. Is that okay? So we'll just finish this off while we've got our juices going on this stuff. Are you comfortable with the wording as discussed around 2.8?
That you take that motion separately.
Yes, they will be all taken separately, but we're okay with 2.8?
So 2.8 will now read invites staff and HBRC to engage with.
Yes.
We don't invite. I would tell the staff to invite HBRC.
Whatever the word is that gets us there. Just, do you want to come back to this? Get this done.
Requested staff and invites HBRC to engage with. It solves this issue. Yep. And then we strike the words we earlier agreed to. We strike and through.
Yep.
Is that all good?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so we'll come back and vote on it shortly.
We haven't seconded it.
No, we're not, we're just we're modifying the current. We are framing this up to.
I move that as.
No, but please don't move it.
Is there any chance that these can be moved in block?
No, there's no chance at all.
No chance. And we're going to
He
be
said next
another
week's
5
the
minute
last week,
speech
then
on
we could-
each one.
Okay, I appreciate what you're saying, but people do
Time
want.
for you to catch your flight by then.
5 o'clock.
Well, listen, going through these as stated, are there any other adjustments before we get to the point of people moving and etc.? James, I do have that question in terms of RWSS and now Tuki catchment. Is there an agreement to incorporate the catchment issues instead of singular reference to RWSS? Is there any?
You're making a
Can
meal
I-
of this, Chair.
No,
Can
I'm
I
not.
just-
I'm getting you there.
I'm just wondering if I can suggest, if we are going to pause with tourism on the door, that James might have half an hour to go and write up what we will be considering next week.
You
Or
happy
is
with
that too much pressure?
Uh,
So we can
no.
look at, we know what we're actually see it again in writing.
Leanne's just preparing some now, so I think we're there in terms of the recs. So it's really only just this residual issue around HBRC being enabled to expend resources on matters wider than their own consent conditions, which, yeah, I mean, look, the intention had always been to bring you back advice about the wider catchment management issues alongside what the RWSS is doing, so you get a holistic picture. That message has been understood, and that is the intention. It's just a question of whether HBRC's moratorium gets expanded out for expenditure on those wider issues or not.
Why should HBRC be asked, or be capable for that matter, of dealing with the issues for the whole catchment as opposed to the...
Well, look, clearly there's not support for that, so let's drop that idea. And we can debate it and amendments made. I'm just trying to facilitate a smooth process, which is not getting far.
We could accept half the loaf that we'll let you flip them, but not change them.
Sorry, look, we and Councillor Bevan, is this of high importance and moment?
It is, Chair. So, because this is another element of this which hasn't been discussed at all, which is the possibility that 2.5 might be lost, which deals with the introduction of a CP in relation to environment. And bearing in mind that James has said that it's important to signal that if it does get lost because we're going to do it later, it's important to send that signal. So I think we need to incorporate appropriate wordings. If 2.5 is lost, we need to incorporate appropriate wording into the 2.6.
James, are you able to draft something that looks like that for consideration after tourism have spoken?
I'm not entirely clear what it is we're looking at. I've just provided with Leanne with a catch-all resolution right at the end, which would be that staff report back, and it'll be for next week, on the status of all existing CPs and any recommended modifications or additions to CPs.
Yeah, so this is not a current CP, and it might not get adopted today, but I think there'd be general agreement around the table that there should be an environmental CP in there that might need to be drawn up later. And you want to send a signal that that's what we're going to do. So if 2.5 is not passed, we need to still send that signal. That's the point I'm making.
And what I'm suggesting.
Sure. Let's not vex ourselves now. Let's hold those for resolution, also recommendation, and as we go. So, are you okay to suspend our current item and move to tourism? Let's do that. A brief bathroom break while we transit to